without inner collapse. It does not bargain for safety. It does not plead to be met. It stands on its own ground. There is a moment, often quiet, easily missed, when the empath realizes that their old fear of loneliness has vanished. Not because they are surrounded by people, but because they are no longer abandoning themselves in order to avoid being alone. This realization carries a strange kind of grief and relief at once. Grief for the years spent misunderstanding solitude, and relief that solitude no longer feels like a verdict on one's worth. In this state, the empath may still feel sadness at times. Sadness is not pathology. It is the natural response to depth, but sadness now moves through them without becoming despair. It does not spiral into self-blame. It does not demand immediate resolution through contact. It is allowed to exist, to inform, to pass. This capacity to remain with one's own emotional states without outsourcing regulation is what truly distinguishes the empath protected by experience from the empath still caught in old patterns. The former has learned that emotional intensity does not require immediate relational discharge. Feeling can be held internally without harm. This alone transforms the entire relational field. From this place, the empath may even find themselves more open to humanity as a whole, while being more selective with individuals. Compassion broadens, but intimacy narrows. This is not contradiction. It is hierarchy. Not all humans require access to the same inner spaces. Universal empathy does not require universal closeness. Here, the archetype of the sovereign begins to take shape, not the ruler over others, but the ruler of one's own inner kingdom. The sovereign archetype is marked by responsibility rather than control, by boundaries rather than dominance. When this archetype integrates, the empath no longer fears being alone, nor do they cling when connection appears. They stand in relation as an equal, not as a caretaker or a supplicant. It is worth noting that many empaths reach this stage later in life, often after repeated relational disappointments. This timing is not a failure. It is a function of how long it takes experience to teach what no book can convey. Sensitivity without boundaries often needs pain to become intelligent. This is tragic, but it is also human. What matters is that the lesson, once learned, tends to remain. The empath does not forget what it cost to arrive here. And because of this, their few friendships, if they have them, are not casual. They are chosen. They are sustained by presence rather than performance. They do not require the empath to disappear in order to function. So, when you encounter an empath with few friends, do not rush to diagnose loneliness. Look instead for signs of inner order. Look for calm that does not depend on reassurance. Look for boundaries that do not need explanation. Look for a person who listens, but no longer absorbs, who cares, but no longer carries what is not theirs. Such a person is not diminished by their small circle. They are protected by experience, and that protection is not a wall against life, but a structure that allows life to be lived without continual psychic injury. In the final movement of this lecture, I will speak of how this protection, once fully integrated, reshapes destiny itself, how the empath's path diverges quietly from the collective, how meaning replaces belonging as the organizing principle of life. and how what was once called loneliness reveals itself, at last, as a form of inner freedom. As this protection settles more deeply into the psyche, something even more profound begins to reorganize itself beneath conscious awareness. The empath's life ceases to be oriented around belonging and begins to turn, almost imperceptibly, toward meaning. This is a decisive shift, and it is one that the collective often fails to recognize, because it does not announce itself with visible markers of success or social approval. Yet inwardly, it marks the moment when the individual's destiny loosens itself from the expectations of the group. Belonging is a powerful instinct. It binds us to family, culture, and shared narratives of value. For the empath, belonging was once achieved through accommodation, through sensitivity finely attuned to what others needed or expected. But meaning operates differently. Meaning does not ask how well one fits. It asks whether one's life is aligned with an inner truth that demands expression. When meaning becomes primary, many forms of belonging quietly fall away, not through rejection, but through irrelevance. This is why the empath, protected by experience, often feels as though they are walking slightly out of step with the world. They are not rebellious, they are not contrarian, they simply no longer organize their life around what secures approval. Their decisions are guided by an inner compass that has been calibrated through suffering, reflection, and repeated disillusionment. The psyche has learned that to betray this compass is to invite collapse. Here, destiny must be understood not as fate imposed from without, but as a trajectory emerging from within. The empath's destiny does not unfold through dramatic gestures, it unfolds through quiet refusals. The refusal to over-explain, to overgive, to remain where the soul contracts. Each refusal clears psychic space, and in that space, a different kind of life becomes possible. Often this life appears simpler from the outside, fewer relationships, less noise, more routine. But simplicity is not shallowness, it is concentration. The empath's energy, once dispersed across many emotional demands, now gathers around a smaller number of pursuits that feel intrinsically meaningful. These pursuits may be creative, contemplative, or relational in a very limited sense. What unites them is that they do not require self-betrayal to sustain. At this stage, the empath may encounter moments of existential doubt when the old metrics of success, popularity, visibility, affirmation no longer guide the way. A question arises: how do I know that my life matters? This question is not answered by applause. It is answered by resonance. The empath begins to feel, sometimes with quiet astonishment, that certain choices produce an inner rightness that cannot be argued away. This rightness is the psyche's affirmation. In dreams, symbols of paths, rivers, or solitary figures moving through vast landscapes may appear. These are images of individuation, nearing maturity. The soul is no longer oriented toward the center of the group, but toward its own unfolding. This does not make the empath superior to others. It makes them responsible for themselves in a deeper way. Responsibility here does not mean burden, it means authorship. The empath is no longer living primarily in response to others' needs, histories, or wounds. They are responding to an inner necessity. This is a lonely place only if one still believes that companionship is the sole antidote to isolation. But when inner coherence is strong, aloneness does not feel like abandonment, it feels like integrity. This is the point at which many empaths realize that what they once feared most, standing alone, is what finally allows them to stand upright. The psychic crouch that once accompanied constant adaptation disappears. Posture change, not just physically but psychologically. The empath occupies their life more fully, even if that life is quieter than expected. It is important to acknowledge that this path is not glamorous. It does not promise constant joy, it promises congruence. And congruence, while deeply stabilizing, can feel austere. There are fewer distractions from one's own inner conflicts. The empath must now face themselves directly, without the buffer of others' emotions to process. This is demanding work, but it is honest work, and honesty, once established internally, reshapes all future relationships. When the empath does connect, whether briefly or enduringly, it is from a place of choice rather than need. There is no hidden agenda, no unconscious hope that the other will provide identity, safety, or worth. The relationship is allowed to be what it is, not what it must become to compensate for inner lack. Such relationships are rare, but they are real. They often feel understated. There is no urgency to define them, no pressure to intensify prematurely. They grow slowly, if they grow at all, and if they end, they do not leave devastation in their wake. The empath grieves, but they do not fragment. The center holds. This holding is what ultimately reveals the truth about loneliness. Loneliness is not the absence of others, it is the absence of self-connection. When the empath lived primarily through others, loneliness was constant even in company. Now, living from within, loneliness may visit, but it does not dominate. It is recognized as a transient state, not an existential verdict. There is a quiet dignity that emerges here. The empath no longer needs to be seen by everyone, because they are finally seen by themselves. This self-recognition is not narcissistic, it is reparative. It restores a relationship that was long neglected, the relationship between the conscious ego and the deeper self. When that relationship is repaired, life gains a different texture. Time feels less frantic. Decisions feel less fraught. The empath is no longer chasing a sense of arrival. They are inhabiting their life as it unfolds. Even uncertainty becomes more tolerable because it is faced from a stable center rather than from panic. This is why experience, painful as it is, serves as protection. It strips away illusions that kept the empath vulnerable to exploitation. It teaches limits not as defenses against love, but as conditions for its survival. And it leads the empath to a paradoxical discovery that having few friends may actually be the result of having finally become a true friend to oneself. I want to leave you with this understanding because it runs counter to much of what the world teaches. You are not required to be accessible to be valuable. You are not required to be surrounded to be whole. The psyche knows when it has given enough, and when it withdraws, it does so not to punish you, but to preserve you. If you find yourself with fewer companions than before, do not rush to fill the space. Listen instead to what has grown in that space. Listen to the calm, the clarity, the new intolerance for what once drained you. These are not signs of failure. They are signs that experience has done its quiet work. The empath protected by experience has not closed their heart. They have placed it where it can beat without being constantly bruised. And in that protected rhythm, life no longer crowded, no longer chaotic begins, at last, to feel like one's own. And yet, even as this inner freedom stabilizes, there is a final refinement. The psyche must undergo one that is often overlooked, because it does not announce itself as growth. It announces itself as restraint. The empath, now protected by experience, learns not only when to step back, but when not to step forward. This is a subtler discipline than withdrawal, and it requires a deep trust in timing. Earlier in life, the empath moved quickly toward connection, believing that immediacy was sincerity. Now, there is a willingness to let things unfold slowly, even to let them pass without intervention. This patience is not indifference, it is reverence for the psyche's rhythm. The empath has learned that not every feeling requires expression, not every resonance requires pursuit, and not every potential relationship deserves embodiment. Some things are meant to be felt inwardly and allowed to dissolve. This capacity to refrain marks the final separation from compulsive empathy. Compulsion always carries urgency. It says, act now, explain now, soothe now, fix now. Experience teaches the empath that urgency often belongs to the past, not the present. It is the echo of old survival strategies, not a reliable guide to current reality. When urgency fades, choice becomes possible. At this stage, the empath's sensitivity no longer dictates behavior. It informs it. Sensitivity becomes a sense organ rather than a command. Feelings are received, interpreted, and integrated rather than immediately acted upon. This integration is what grants the empath a new authority not over others, but over their own inner movements. One sees this authority most clearly in moments of misunderstanding. In the past, being misunderstood was intolerable to the empath. It threatened attachment, triggered guilt, and demanded immediate clarification. Now, misunderstanding can be endured without panic. The empath recognizes that being fully understood by everyone is neither possible nor necessary. Meaning no longer depends on consensus. This tolerance for misunderstanding further reduces the need for a large social circle. Many relationships are maintained through constant clarification, reassurance, and mutual mirroring. When one party no longer participates in this maintenance, the relationship either deepens into something quieter and truer, or it fades. The empath allows both outcomes without force. Here, something crucial must be said about compassion. True compassion does not require proximity. It does not require constant availability. Compassion can exist alongside distance. The empath, protected by experience, may feel deeply for others' suffering while refusing to enter dynamics that would reopen old wounds. This refusal is often misread as hardness. In truth, it is an expression of compassion that includes the self. Including the self in compassion is the empath's great correction. For many years, compassion was outward facing only. The self was excluded, treated as an inexhaustible resource rather than a living system with limits. Experience teaches the empath that compassion without self-inclusion becomes cruelty by another name. As this realization settles, the empath's inner dialogue changes tone. The harsh inner critic that once accused them of selfishness for needing space begins to soften. A more parental voice emerges, firm, calm, protective. This is an image of the self taking on a guiding role that was once absent. The psyche is no longer self-policing through shame, it is self-regulating through care. In dreams, this may appear as a stable structure, a well-built house, a tower, a fortified place with windows rather than walls. These images indicate not isolation, but containment with permeability. The empath is neither exposed nor imprisoned. They can see out, and others can see in, but entry is no longer automatic. This balanced containment allows for a different relationship to the collective as well. The empath may participate less, speak less, react less, but when they do engage, it carries weight. Their words are fewer, but they are truer. Their presence is quieter, but it is grounded. They no longer need to be everywhere to feel that they belong somewhere. Belonging, at this level, becomes existential rather than social. The empath belongs to their own life. They belong to their inner process. They belong to the unfolding of meaning that no external group can fully authorize or revoke. This belonging is not granted. It is claimed through fidelity to one's inner truth. It is worth noting that this fidelity often reshapes the empath's relationship to time. There is less urgency to achieve, to arrive, to be recognized. Life is no longer a race toward validation. It becomes a dialogue with depth. Days may appear uneventful from the outside, yet inwardly they are rich with reflection, insight, and subtle shifts of understanding. This inward richness does not make the empath detached from the world. It makes them less reactive to it. They are no longer pulled into every emotional weather system that passes through their environment. They can witness without absorbing, empathize without merging, care without collapsing. This is not emotional numbness. It is emotional differentiation. Differentiation is the quiet achievement at the heart of this entire journey. The empath learns where they end and others begin, not through theory, but through the accumulated evidence of lived experience. And once learned, this boundary does not feel restrictive. It feels relieving. Energy, once spent on constant emotional vigilance, is freed for creativity, contemplation, and authentic engagement. At this point, the empath may look back on earlier versions of themselves with tenderness rather than judgment. They see how innocence mistook endurance for love, how loyalty became self-abandonment, how openness without protection invited injury. This backward glance is not regretful, it is compassionate. The empath recognizes that they could not have learned these lessons any other way. This compassion for the past self further dissolves the need for external affirmation. The empath no longer seeks to prove that their suffering was justified. They no longer need others to acknowledge what was endured. The psyche has integrated the experience, the lesson has been metabolized, and so we arrive at the quiet truth that underlies the entire arc. The empath with few friends is not incomplete. They are complete enough to no longer require constant relational scaffolding. They have internalized what they once sought externally, safety, validation, and belonging. What remains is a life that may look sparse, but is internally coherent. This coherence is not flashy. It does not advertise itself, but it is unmistakable to those who sense it. It is felt as steadiness, as depth without urgency, as presence without demand. Such a person does not chase connection, nor do they flee it. They meet it when it aligns, and release it when it does not. In a world that equates worth with visibility and connection with quantity, this way of being will always appear strange. But the psyche does not answer to trends. It answers to balance, and balance, once restored, carries its own quiet authority. If you find yourself standing in this place surrounded by fewer people than before, less driven to explain, less willing to overextend, do not assume that something has gone wrong. Consider the possibility that something has finally gone right. Consider that experience has completed its work, not by hardening you, but by teaching you how to remain open without being unguarded. The empath protected by experience is not lonely. They are no longer at war with themselves, and in that inner peace earned, not given, they discover a form of freedom that no crowd could ever provide. There is, before we truly conclude, one last inner movement worth speaking aloud, not because it is dramatic, but because it is decisive. It concerns how the empath now relates to loss itself. Earlier in life, loss felt catastrophic. When a friendship ended, when distance appeared, when someone withdrew or misunderstood, the empath experienced it as a judgment on their worth. Loss was personalized. It meant failure, rejection, or inadequacy. This interpretation kept the empath bound to relationships long after their vitality had faded, because leaving felt synonymous with being abandoned or worse, becoming the abandoner. But experience alters this meaning completely. The empath protected by experience comes to see loss differently. Loss is no longer a verdict, it is information. It signals misalignment, energetic asymmetry, or the natural completion of a cycle. This does not make loss painless, but it makes it intelligible. Pain without meaning wounds deeply. Pain with meaning transforms. This transformation is subtle. It shows itself in how the empath grieves. There is less self-blame, less compulsive review of what could have been done differently, less bargaining with memory. Grief becomes quieter, slower, more inward. It moves through the body and psyche without demanding that identity be reorganized around it. This is crucial because it marks the final release from relational over-identification. The empath no longer defines themselves by who stays or who leaves. Relationships are no longer proof of value, they are expressions of timing and compatibility. This frees the empath from the unconscious compulsion to preserve connection at any cost. At this point, even solitude changes its tone again. Earlier, solitude was refuge. Now it becomes something else, a natural condition of inwardly oriented life. The empath does not retreat into it defensively, nor do they seek to escape it. It simply exists, like a spacious room within which the psyche can move freely. From this room, life is perceived differently. Noise is felt more acutely. Superficiality becomes tiring. Forced intimacy feels intrusive. The empath's nervous system, now regulated, resists what once seemed normal. This resistance is not intolerance, it is attunement. The psyche has recalibrated its sense of what is nourishing, and because of this recalibration, the empath's future does not unfold according to social expectation. It unfolds according to inner necessity. There may be long periods with no new significant relationships at all. There may be brief encounters that leave deep impressions without turning into bonds. There may be one or two enduring connections that remain largely private and invisible to the outer world. None of this signals deficiency. It signals that the empath has crossed a threshold few recognize and fewer articulate. The threshold where relationship ceases to be a strategy for survival and becomes a meeting of two autonomous inner worlds. Such meetings cannot be manufactured. They cannot be pursued aggressively. They occur when inner structures are stable enough to allow genuine encounter without fusion or defense. This is why the empath protected by experience often stops searching. Searching implies lack. What replaces it is readiness, not readiness for anything, but readiness for what fits. And readiness has a paradoxical quality. It often attracts less, but what it attracts is truer. At this stage, the empath's sensitivity no longer makes them easy to access. It makes them precise. They sense immediately when a situation asks them to shrink, overfunction, or disappear. And just as immediately, something in them declines not angrily, not dramatically, but definitively. There is no internal debate. The psyche has learned. This learning is irreversible. One might say that the empath has become conservative with their inner life, not in the ideological sense, but in the psychological one. Energy is invested carefully, emotional exposure is earned, trust is built slowly, not because the empath is afraid, but because they now understand the cost of giving it prematurely.